Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview podcast, where we talk about all things DCW, or as the subtitle of my theology book, Mike, I've decided on a DCW-aware approach to theology. In other words, you don't have to adopt everything I say, or I'm not explaining things the way every DCWer has to think, but a DCW-aware approach, I think, is a nice way to say it. So that's how I see our time together. Thanks again, Mike, for joining me. We are going to do John 13 this time, back to our study of the book of John. We've spent some time with some Q&A questions, and again, thanks for sending things in. Continue to do so, as if you'd like to. The address is questions.dcwp@gmail.com. I'd like to begin, though, Mike, with a question that came in individually to me, and you folks are welcome to do that if you want, but ronjohnson7@gmail is my email. And his name is Tim, and he gave an introductory discussion. And then he said this: what need did this is in relation to atonement discussion that we've had, Mike, but I like his angle of questioning here. What need did a Second Temple Yahweh loyal Jew have for Jesus, since they were already in the family and had the sacrificial method of cleansing for ritual purity to approach Yahweh? Now, if you've not been with us on this podcast, that's presuming a lot of conversation that has come before this, but for those of you that have been with us, I have recommended that atonement language in the Old Testament and flowing into the New has to do with ritual and purity, and approaching sacred space is the issue. And in their world, that was very important for the worship both of Yahweh and his Messiah. My quick answer, which I didn't write out, I didn't create any slides for this, Mike, so let me just throw an idea at you as an idea that would answer this question. If you're a loyal Second Temple Jew, what need would you have for Jesus? Because you're already in the family, you're already, quote, a holy one, as Ephesians talks about it, and Colossians, I believe, as well. My answer would be, and this goes to Romans 15, verse 8. I'm going to quote it to you. I appreciate the question because it makes me think of one of my favorite verses. In Romans 15, and I like Scott McKnight's view that you should read Romans backwards if you want to figure out what it's about, because, in other words, his main point is held for the end of the book, which isn't uncommon for a letter, but for us who want to know what a book's about, why not read it backwards? And he said Romans 15 is probably giving us a better view of what it's about than any other chapter. In verse 7, he says, Paul does, therefore receive one another just as Christ also received us, or you, some texts say, to the glory of God. Now I say, here it comes, that Jesus Christ has become a servant to the circumcision for the truth of God, to confirm the promises made to the fathers, and that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy. Now, and I could read on where it talks about, what he does is he grabs verses from the Old Testament about Gentile inclusion. But that first line there, when Tim asked the question, what need does a loyal Jew have for the sacrifice of Jesus, I would say, notice that sacrificial language is used mostly in the New Testament for Gentiles. In other words, Paul is the apostle to Gentiles, so maybe that's a slam dunk that's too easy to argue for. But when Paul writes, he's almost always writing to a Gentile audience. And so that's why he would be the person to watch for sacrificial language for Jesus' death, which makes sense then. But here's where he adds the Jewish side of the question. And he says, Jesus Christ has become a servant to the circumcision for, and here's his line, the truth of God. And aletheia in Greek often has the sense of promise keeping, fulfilling a promise that you've made. The truth of God. To confirm, and then he even lines it up with this, to confirm the promises made to the fathers. So, what does a Jew need from Jesus specifically? Since I've argued previously that he does not need to have his sins paid for, that's not how the story goes. What a Jew needs from Jesus, or about Jesus, or how do we say this? When it comes to the person of Jesus, what is Yahweh, the Father, looking for? I would say he's wanting that loyal Jew to believe who Jesus is and how he fits into the plan of the Father. And so it'd be like a father sending, well, this is exactly what happens. The father sends the son and says, now take my son for who he is and for how much I love him, and listen to him and obey him and understand that that he's been given all the kingdoms of the world. He will be the final judge over all humanity and all those things we've talked about. And so the loyal Jew is not expected to just stand by idly and say, well, I need sacrifice. No, he's supposed to say, oh, this answers, this is the truth of God. This is the promise-keeping nature of my God, that he would send Jesus. And then you'd fill in all those things that I just said. So to me, it's a good question in the sense that if we're going to say, and I've said it, so I think I owe Tim an answer. If atonement is about ritual purification, and Jews already have that, what do Jews need Jesus for? And I would say Romans 15:8 nails it. You believe as a Jew that Jesus is the promised Messiah. He fills in all the gaps of Old Testament thinking, and he is the one that Yahweh has, or the Father has, lined up all the future around. And you say that's the one that God has sent us. And I believe in both Yahweh and Jesus because of this. I'm going to buy in full force what God has done with and through Jesus. So something like that. Any thoughts there?
I mean, I think I would also throw in that this is a confirmation of the promises that were made through the prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel about how ultimately, it's not like they didn't keep up with the rituals even during Jeremiah's time. The problem is that they were doing those rituals and doing the temple worship to Yahweh, but they were also adding on top of it worship to Baal, or worship to Asherah, or worship to Molech, or worship to whoever god they wanted to give extra credit to. And God's response ultimately is, I will need to take their hearts of stone, soften it, and give them a new heart, essentially. And later on, Jesus in the Gospels, especially in the Gospel of John, he made it over and over, this promise that I am sending you the Holy Spirit, that I'm not leaving you alone, I'm sending you the Spirit of God. And so thus, that's part of also what's involved for the Jew, of why this is actually important to come to Jesus, because that's part of the promise to those who are his followers, that they receive the very presence of God within their own bodies as the new temple of the Holy Spirit. Yeah. And so I think there's a lot more that's involved than even just going into the book of Hebrews this past month at Awakening for our Bible reading. There's been this kind of reminder that Jesus does a lot even after the crucifixion. That exactly. In his ascension, in what he's currently doing right now, there's still a lot of stuff that he's doing.
Which is my concern. Yeah, that the PSA, or the penal substitution models, even if it's right, it spends too much time on that issue. And it forgets that it limits, or it doesn't talk enough about the present reign of Christ and his resurrection, what it means to us as people who need resurrection, those kind of questions. And we're going to come to that in John here, by the way.
I think that there's a very strong fixation, right, on always looking back towards the cross. And I think that's at times why I have issues with the Christocentric kind of hermeneutic, because it almost sets it up as though, well, we always want to look at the cross. If we're looking at the Old Testament, we want to look towards the cross. If we're in the New Testament, we're always looking back to the cross. But I think the Christotelic model is actually a better way of viewing things, that everything is looking towards Christ. Even us in the current present right now, we are still looking for Christ, because he said that he's coming back. And so there are things that are currently going on that the book of Hebrews even alludes to, that there's a lot that's happening in the midst of his post-ascension that he's doing on behalf of his people. And I think the PSA folks who do fixate on that a lot, even if they may be correct on some aspects, that it's a very small amount of our theology, and there's so much more to what we were taught in the scriptures.
Yeah. Tim, the questioner, finishes with, why is there such an emphasis on the belief in Jesus in all Christian branches? If anyone can be loyal to God without Jesus, For example, people in the Old Testament, such as Gentiles like Naaman. I'm going to save that for our conversation here in John 14, our next podcast. He ends with this: should I read John Piper's book, 50 Reasons Why Jesus Came to Die? To which I always say, anybody who says, should I read ... I'm always going to end by saying or answer with ... absolutely. In other words, you don't read. There's nothing you don't read. And that book is good because Piper opens up all the possibilities textually, theologically, and so forth that Jesus died. What we often think of as the death of Jesus is the atonement. And I'm, of course, recommending that atonement is a subset of thought within the larger question of the death of Jesus. So the book, 50 Reasons Why Jesus Came to Die by Piper, I would certainly recommend. I'm ready to jump into John 13. Okay, Mike, Let's do it. I'd recommend, if you're listening and watching especially, I'm going to have some nice charts and graphs on the screen to follow if you can watch, or if you can have a Bible open, because we're going to get very specific about timing here. And so do your best if you're just listening, but let's try it out. John 13:1. Now, before the feast of the Passover. Notice where we are in the story. We'll talk about timing in just a moment. But he starts John 13 with before the feast of the Passover. This is, of course, the Passover in which Jesus dies. When Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. I recommend that you could even feel in John 13:1 a sense of pause. The writer is looking into the audience in front of him saying, let's think about how much Jesus loved not only his Father, but loved those that his Father had given him, those that he loved to the end, as it says there. So 13:1 gives us reason to step back and think in terms of timing that may not be strictly chronological. That's where I'm going with that. 13:2, during supper. Now, got to stop there. During this answer, or asking what supper are we talking about, is going to put into motion so much of the theology of the next 4 chapters, because these 2 words, during supper, or as some textual variants have, after supper, doesn't really matter, but during supper. And now we're going to have 4 chapters, 13, 14, 15, and 16, and 17 as well. Is that 5 chapters? That are dependent on what supper we're talking about. So let's quickly think in terms of chronology of the Passion Week. Here's where we know, let's start with what we know and work backwards. John 12:12 is the triumphal entry. We've already seen that. We've already talked about that last time. And that's on a Sunday, okay? And that will be a Sunday before the coming or starting the week of Jesus' Passion or his death. We know that he resurrects on John 20, verse 1 on a Sunday as well. So there's your week, Passion Week, John 12:12 through John 20, verse 1. Now, back up one day, John 12:9, we know that's a Saturday based on the next day kind of language. And in 12:9, you'd mark it as the day that the enemies are said to arrange for Lazarus' death, after Lazarus had been raised from the dead. Moving ahead, this is not in John, but we know from Matthew, Mark, and Luke that Passover would be the coming Thursday. Okay, so I'm just putting things on our chart that we can nail down as for sure's, shall we say. Thursday will be the last Passover of Jesus' life. And again, that's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Never mentioned in John, the Passover itself. That puts Jesus' crucifixion on Friday, because we know he's crucified the day after he has the last Passover with his disciples. Now, that is in John 19 and so forth. We have the crucifixion, and that is basically understood among all commentators to be on Friday of the Passion Week. Now, here's where John 12:1, our last study back in John 12, we noticed this line, 6 days before the Passover, John 12:1. And that's going to be important for reasons you'll see in just a moment. To figure out what that day would be now, so we start with Thursday. That's our marking point, right? 6 days before the Passover, and start counting backwards. Day 1 would be Wednesday. Day 2 would be Tuesday. Day 3 is Monday, going backwards. Day 4 would be Sunday, the triumphal entry. Day 5 would be the Saturday in which the enemies are plotting Lazarus' death, and that makes Day 6 Friday. So my point is that we have a marker back in John 12:1 that we are one day, we're 6 days before the Passover, which, that's what John says, 6 days before the Passover. Now, the reason this is important is because of what happens in 13, and we just got there. John 12:2, to catch our bearings again, says this: Lazarus, Mary, Martha, and guests in his home made Jesus a supper. The Greek word behind that in 12:2 is deipnon. And we talked about this in John 12, but let me just quickly again rehearse it. What is a deipnon? This is from BDAG. It's the main meal of the day, generally. It's not a religious term at all. It's, this is just good old Koine Greek. An everyday meal, a dinner, a supper, a formal meal with guests, and so forth. So it's a pretty average word, and it just means meal or dinner, something like that. Here's the question I want to, again, get to, because how we define 13 is going to be dependent on this, and how we define 13 is going to push our theology forward into the next 5 chapters. What I did on my Accordance computer, and you can do this on Logos, I'm sure, too, I asked it, does the word deipnon occur, you can see it here, within 1,000 words of the word Pesach, or Passover, in Greek, in the New Testament? Now, I kind of knew this would be what happens, but when you hit enter, you get nothing. In other words, the answer is no. The word deipnon never occurs even within 1,000 words in the New Testament of the word Passover. The point is that in the New Testament, a deipnon, or a supper, is used, and you can count it up, 16 times, 4 times in John, but it's never associated with the Passover meal. A deipnon is not part of the Passover meal. There's plenty of discussion about Passover in the Gospels. There's 16 or some uses of deipnon. Those two ideas never cross each other. Here are the 4 uses of deipnon in John. The first one, 12:2, right there where Lazarus, Mary, and Martha make him a supper. So at 12:2, that's the first of 4 uses in John. The second 2 uses in John are coming up in chapter 13. We just read verse 2, during supper. In 13:4, he will rise from supper. So that's the same story. And then one more time in John 21, it's looking back to the story of John 13. It's the one who leaned against Jesus during the supper. So if you're following my point here, we have a supper made in 12:2, and would the reader, the listener, especially the oral, the person who's sitting on the floor listening to John or someone read the Gospel of John to them, which is likely how they came to the book, right? They heard it. Would the original reader or listener have understood these to be referring to the same event? I would say yes, because in 12:2, they made him a dinner, and the next time it's used is, during dinner. In other words, it's picking up the same storyline. So 13:2, we just read this, during dinner. And I'm recommending, thus, we're not talking Passover. Now, if you're thinking with me, you'll realize what a major interpretive move you make by coming to this understanding. In other words, if this isn't Passover, then what happens coming up here in chapter 13 takes a completely different turn. And by the way, I don't know, Mike, if I've mentioned this to you before, but really what got me into this when I was teaching John a while back on a undergraduate level was Ben Witherington's book called Making a Meal of It. Rethinking the Theology of the Lord's Supper. Baylor, it's got to be 2005-ish, 6-ish, 2007. What I love about Ben Witherington, he writes as he thinks, which can be a problem, but not for him. It's just beautiful writing. But he'll often go off onto to tangents that may not have anything to do with where he was the previous paragraph. But that's some of the most delicious stuff he writes, is his tangents, because it's so biblically formative. And in this book, Making a Meal of It, he goes through and he does it as though he's wistfully wondering, could this be? Could this be? And he takes the position ultimately, I'll say it that way, that yes, in John 13:2, when you have this line, during supper, and let's get back to it on our screen here, that he is referring back to the supper of John 12:2, where Jesus is sitting with Mary, Martha, Lazarus, and a group of people in Lazarus's home after the resurrection or the resuscitation of Lazarus. Okay. Anything you want to jump in with, or otherwise I'm ready to keep moving.
I mean, I'm curious then, because it almost feels like that the events that take place in this whole entire thing, because this is a big monologue that's going to be coming up.
I know,
right? Like, and so it almost sounds like it. I mean, I can kind of see how maybe within John's gospel he just compresses time, if that's the case, because there are some of the things that in here do kind of seem to link up with what's happening in the synoptic gospels.
In Passover, you're right. Yeah, we'll talk about those. Yeah, we'll compare notes on that.
Yeah, because you got the whole point where Jesus says Peter's going to deny him.
Yep.
And then you have the same occurrences in Matthew and Luke's gospel where he says a similar thing. And of course, Peter makes a big hoop about, I'm not going to do that.
Right.
And so like a part of me, like I can kind of see why people would get confused, because it seems like there are connections that are happening between the synoptics and then John's gospel, which has always been different, right? It has always been a different style of gospel account than the synoptics. And so I can kind of see what you mean if this is referencing back to chapter 12 and to the 6 days before. But that also would mean that we have to be aware of the possibility that John is basically compressing 6 days in a matter of a couple of verses, and he's jumping without letting us as the reader, as the audience, actually know.
That a couple of things happened twice, including Peter's denying his denial and Judas's being identified. But we're going to get to that. So that's a good point. I mean, you can sense, I can sense you're thinking ahead on me here, that if we make this the supper of John 12, that changes this whole dialogue, because now we have it in front of a group of people that are not his 12 apostles. We have it in front of probably some Gentiles and probably a scattered group of people that you would think the disciples would be uncomfortable with, including someone who just spent 4 days in a tomb. So,
yeah, and also like Judas runs off,
right? So let's do this. Let's start reading again in John 13:2. But I'm going to read it. This is the test drive that I'm going to play out here. In other words, instead of just saying during supper, let's fill in the blanks. During the supper in Lazarus's home, 6 days before Jesus was killed. Get that from 12:2. Now let's keep going. When the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. So that means Judas has been thinking about this, and he will by the time he plants a kiss on Jesus' cheek in Matthew 26, which is Thursday night, Friday morning. He will have spent a week thinking about this, planning it, plotting it, so forth and so on, right? Knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, that he, Jesus, had come from God and was going back to God. I find that an interesting phrase. I think defending for those who, and I know we have some listeners, just so you know, there are some listeners that are biblical Unitarians. They do not believe that Jesus is a deity. They are Christian. They believe he's the Messiah, but they don't believe that he is a deity. And my point to them would be, and we have fruitful, fair conversations, that there is enough for me personally, including lines like this, come from God and going back to God. The Greek is very clear on this. Going back to God. It's all part of that Greek phrase there. Tells me personally that this is a person who spent his, I'm going to call it, ungenerated pre-existence in God's presence and now is going back to God. To me, that's clear enough there. But anyway, I'm going to move on. He rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, taking a towel, tied it around his waist. By the way, that word supper there is again deipnon, the third use in the book of John. He poured water into a
Ron,
basin. Yeah.
If anything, can you go back to that just that previous moment? Because I think sometimes we skip that too quickly.
Which I did.
No, I mean, I'm just saying this in general. I think it's one of those interesting moments where I've for over almost 2 decades now, I've always been fascinated by just this moment, because John, or the writer here, is at the very least saying all power and authority is under Jesus at this moment, right? In this moment, he has all the power. He knows he's come from God. He's going back to God. What is he going to do with all that authority and power?
Yep.
And he lays his outer garments. He basically dresses himself down to become a servant.
Yeah.
And to me, that is a fascinating moment of how is power supposed to be used properly? And Jesus demonstrates in this moment, it's not to be lorded over. It's not to dominate. It's not to demand that to be enslaved. Instead, he uses the power that he has been granted and makes himself into a servant.
Yeah, I'm glad you caught it. Thank you, Mike, for bringing it up. It's a very beautiful text. He poured, let's continue what he does do. He poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with a towel. If you've ever seen a video of this, it's messy. If you've ever done it, you've felt how messy it is. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" And Jesus said, remember this famous back and forth, "What I am doing you don't understand now, but afterward you will." I think, again, you just unpacked what that afterward meant, that someone would catch this, that all power is given to this person, and yet he takes the time to wash feet. I think that's what Jesus knows is going to be happening. Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." This is so, Peter-like. Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me, no part with me." In Greek, meros, and the idea of part, or you don't understand who I am or what I'm doing, why I'm doing it. That my ministry and your future ministry is based on this kind of activity.
Yeah.
You have no share with me, Jesus says. And Simon Peter said to him, "Well, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head," probably with a wink or a snicker. "If you're going to wash my feet, then do the whole thing." And Jesus said to him, "The one who has bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you." And we might wonder what he's getting at, and the text nicely fills it in. For he knew who was to betray him. He was speaking of Judas. Not every one of you is clean. That is why he said, "Not all of you are clean." Then when he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments, and by the way, I think there's that line again that would be, this probably took time. The situation, of course, of a triclinium where you lean on an elbow and eat with your feet behind you on these couches or mats was probably the setting here. And so Jesus is working his way around the outside of the triclinium and probably throughout the room. My guess is based upon, again, the Lazarus, Mary, Martha story that's being brought back to us now in John 13. This is a house full of guests who would have been men, women, former lepers, who knows. And the teaching Jesus is about to give gives credence to, I think, the idea that we have people in the room that most Jews would have been uncomfortable normally being around. So then he says, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord." Many people have been saying that. And he says, "You are right, for so I am." And I remember the first time I read this, and someone, I think it was a preacher, brought it up, how we are so used to how this verse ends that we should have been caught off guard by what Jesus says. Pretend you've never heard how this ends. What would you have thought? "If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to," and of course we'd expect him to say, "wash my feet." But he says, he turns it outward and he says, "If I washed yours, you should wash everyone else's." And again, I think when he's saying this, in this setting, he would have looked at people that the average Jew would have said, "I am not touching their feet for nothing." And Jesus is trying to make the point that, no, this is where we're going. "For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. Let me take a
Ron,
moment, and if you have anything to add, I'm more than happy to hear it, Mike, but as you prepare to think, go ahead if you want to.
Look, I think we also should not skip by so quickly in the fact that he knew that Judas was going to betray him.
Mm-hmm.
And the implication is he also washed Judas's feet completely. And what's weird always been to me about this moment, this narrative, is that, Peter talks, but we get no dialogue from Judas. There is like no recorded reaction from how Judas felt at this moment.
Yeah, which is different from the Passover meal where he does talk.
Yeah,
at least he talks. But
he talks. But in this moment, like if he's already been thinking about it, but now all of a sudden he sees his own master, his teacher, that he is on the precipice of deciding to betray or not, wash his feet, and there is no recorded like thought, incident, reaction, nothing. We get it from Peter. We don't get it from Judas. And I've always wondered why. And it's just
we'll hear about him coming up. Yeah, that he will leave the room, and it's night, it says, so we're coming up to that at the end of this chapter, but you're right, it's interesting quietness on his part.
And it's disturbing quietness.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because in Peter we expect, but Judas's quietness, it is so more disturbing because of Peter is sometimes, frankly, an idiot, but Judas, he calculating, and he doesn't say anything.
Yeah. Let's pause for a quick moment and ask, why doesn't the modern church foot wash? You ever wonder that? Well, here's the quick answer. Most evangelicals have historically interpreted Jesus' command to wash each other's feet as symbolic. It's symbolism, rather than sacramental or ordinance, right? The act is thus not binding as a repeated ritual, but rather illustrates this is how we've interpreted it, a deeper ethical principle, humility, self-giving sacrifice, and so forth. Kind of like the holy kiss of Romans 16:16. So foot washing usually has been understood to be translated, as it were, into contemporary forms of service. Secondly, think of the original author or the original audience. Foot washing in the ancient Mediterranean world carried clear social meaning tied to hospitality, status reversal, and embodied humility. We, on the other hand, if we were to do it, and I've done it once, and I was very uncomfortable doing it. It just did not feel right at all. It felt, well, here it is. It's on my screen here. The act can feel awkward, overly intimate, artificially ritualized. Why am I doing this? You have a shower at home. You don't need this, as it were, right? So as a result, churches have often, again, to answer our question, why don't we do it? We often default to more culturally intelligible expressions of service. And so we turn it into volunteering, charity, whatever. So may I recommend that what we're doing is an evangelical form of midrash, in other words, where we observe an interesting application of an idea, a cultural idea, without changing our interpretation of what it meant then, but turning it into something else now. That's a classical use of the concept of midrash, which I think, again, the Old Testament does, or the New Testament does with the Old Testament quite often. My last point about why doesn't the church foot wash is, and I've been here, Mike, I think you have too in your Christian history or your background, denominational background, the reduction of recognized ordinances and the, quote, tradition of spontaneity, I call it. We have a tradition to not have traditions. Within evangelical theology has played a significant role. We are overly cautious people when it comes to practices that might appear formalized, repetitive, sacramental. And so evangelicalism in our modern world feels like foot washing would too easily fall into that. We only traditionally have two ordinances, baptism and the Lord's Supper, on the basis that these, if you ask your teacher at Bible college, and I did this once, my favorite Bible college teacher, I still love him to death, but I remember as a sophomore in college, Mike Heiser was in the class with me, and we were both known for, because we loved our teacher, but we had asked questions, whenever something didn't make sense. And at one point he said, baptism and Lord's Supper, why are those the two ordinances of a Baptist? Because Jesus commanded it, It's practiced in Acts, and it's explained in the epistles. Baptism and the Lord's Supper, commanded by Jesus, practiced in Acts, explained by Paul. Why don't we foot wash? It is commanded by Jesus. It is practiced in Acts, but it's never defined or explained in the epistles. And of course, I put my hand up and I said, who made those rules? Then he laughed, the teacher did, and said, I did. And then he went on. To which I thought to myself, and maybe Mike did too, I never asked him, you stinker, you didn't answer my question. But his laugh and his answer was indicative of that little, that's why Baptists don't foot wash, because Paul doesn't explain it in his epistles. My point is that it's okay. In other words, to me, if you foot wash, go ahead. If you don't foot wash, don't worry about it. In other words, this is going to be a judgment call on whether you want to bring a cultural practice into the modern church and give it, shall we call it, confessional meaning. And I think that's what baptism is. I think that's what the Lord's Supper is. Those are social situations of that period that were not even religious in nature, and they were brought into the church eventually and given confessional meaning. So why don't we foot wash? We just never got around to it. That's my quick answer.
Ron, I don't know if this is a confession, but when I was in youth ministry at my Chinese Heritage Church growing up, the counselors at our youth ministry, they did that actually on one Good Friday Easter season. They basically had all of us, there's a good amount of counselors. There was 8 of them at that time. And I think I was a junior in high school. And the whole entire evening, they actually, all of them had their own bowls of water, their own towels. They basically followed that kind of idea of dressing themselves down and taking on that role of a servant. And I understand what you mentioned about, yes, it feels awkward and everything, but it also is. As a 17-year-old kid, teenager, seeing my adult, counselors, people that I looked up to, they're in their late 20s, early 30s, and yet they were actually serving us in that way. That it was a very tangible, visible expression of, why are you doing this? Mm-hmm. And they were willing to do it. They wanted to do it. And yes, we are, it is evangelical. It's a non-denominational Chinese Heritage Church, and yet they did it.
Yeah, I'd like I say, if your denomination does it, and I have a friend who is part of a foot washing, I forget, is it Church of the Nazarene or something like that? They foot wash. More power to you. I think it can have great power of symbolic meaning. So,
and I think at the very least, I remember asking the guy that I was looking up to as a mentor, and his kind of reaction afterwards and explaining it to us as a group of guys in his Bible study was, it really was I'm trying to model for you what does it mean to follow Jesus. Mm-hmm. And even in this moment that he's the adult, he has, his own reputation, whatever else, and yet he is trying to show to us, this is what it means to serve one another. And that has always left an impression on me. And it's actually why I still remember it.
Cool. And that's where Jesus takes this. Notice again, if this is in the home of Lazarus and Martha and Mary and others, that foot washing ceremony probably had much greater meaning than just the 12 apostles. These are people then that Jesus probably met as servants in homes and things like that. But here he's washing their feet. So here's what Jesus says after it's over. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you that do them. I am not speaking of all of you. I know whom I have chosen. Again, I take that to be the 12 there. But the scripture will be fulfilled. He who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. I'm forgetting the text that's a quote from. I should have looked that one up, but that's Old Testament. Do you have it right there in front of you? I could look at it, I guess. Where's the one? Where does it say that? That's got to put my glasses on for that one. Psalm 41:9. Yeah, it's in the Psalm. So David had that happen to him. A good friend lifted his heel against him, and Jesus is pulling that out of the Psalms, reminding the audience in kind of a backward way without people knowing who it is, probably at this point, that someone there in the room is going to lift his heel against him. Verse 19, I am telling you this now before it takes place, that when it does take place, you may believe that I am he, ego eimi. Truly, truly, I say unto you, whoever receives the one I send receives me. Here's this idea of agency. Now, Jesus is not only the agent of Yahweh, in my opinion, he is now sending agents of himself. Whoever receives the one I send receives me. So it's like sending a singing telegram to your date's front door. They represent you. So when they sing to you, they're singing as though it's me. Whoever receives me receives the one who sent me. He's again giving this group a final what I want here, a mission. Here's what you're going to be doing when I'm absent. After these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, truly, truly, I say unto you, one of you will betray me. Now, here's where, again, this happens in the last Passover, and it happens here, which is usually why people believe this is the last Passover. But in my understanding, again, imagine it this way, this happens twice. Kind of like the cleansing of the temple. It happened twice. That we have something going on here where this is different. What's about to be read is only in John. The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. One of his disciples was reclining at table. Again, remember they lean in with their elbow and eat on their side. Reclining at table at Jesus' side, whom Jesus loved. Who was this disciple leaning on Jesus? This has been the subject of a lot of debate and thought. It's a fun one to run down. And again, I'd recommend Ben Witherington's Making a Meal of It. This is the view that he recommends. He does it over the course of several pages, and I'm going to summarize the view here that I have also found to be very compelling. Who was the disciple leaning on Jesus? Number one, the word disciple, mathetes, is a very common word, often used in the Gospels to denote people other than the 12. So you don't have to automatically think it's one of the 12. It can be any person who follows Jesus, including Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. Number two, the leaning disciple is identified only as Han Hegapa Ha Jesus, whom Jesus loved. That's all we get. Again, back to the verse. One of the disciples was reclining at table at Jesus' side, whom Jesus loved. No name is given, right? So my third point is a question. Would the original listener, the person sitting at the reader's feet when he heard this, have anyone in mind previously described as loved by Jesus? Let's do our textual homework. Only 4 Johannine references prior to John 13 finds an individual being loved, quote, by Jesus. What I mean is, if you look up the idea of someone being loved by Jesus in John's gospel, there are 4 mentions of someone prior to John 13, and here they all are. 11:3, 5, 11, and 36. Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. Jesus loved Mary, Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. Our loved one, ha philos hemon, Lazarus sleeps. The use of the word love on top of Lazarus in 11:11. And then in John 11:36, they said, see how Jesus phileod Lazarus. See how he loved him just after he wept. Now, add to that, after John 11, there are only 4 individuals loved by Jesus, again, in the book of John. If you just look up phileo and agapao and ask, does Jesus love anyone? Here are the only 4 times you have Jesus being said to love anyone. John 13:23, the verse that we're in right now, one of the disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining at Jesus' table. John 19:26, when Jesus saw the disciple whom he loved. John 21:7, that disciple whom Jesus loved, said to Peter. And then John 21, verse 20, Peter saw the disciple whom he loved. So what's interesting is that after John 11, there are 4 individuals who are said to be loved by Jesus. They're never named, and they're probably the same person. Most people believe that 13, 19, and 21 are talking about the same person who is being referred to each time. So go back then to the previous point in John, before John 13. The only male figure that's ever said to be loved by Jesus, and it happens 4 times, is Lazarus, 11:3, 5, 11, and 36. Every time that Jesus loves a male, it's Lazarus. One time he loves Martha and Mary, but otherwise all the references are as a male to Lazarus. So, just one more quick point before we move on. In Greek, and this is normal in English too, but I just want to make it clear that in Greek, a relative clause built with a relative pronoun, ha, he, ha, whom, who, which, or that, is the most common way, one of the most common ways, to refer back to something already mentioned. The man who, the place where, the thing which. When you have that kind of language, Matthew 2:9, the place where the child was. Well, that's because we just talked about where he was. Luke 8:15, but the ones that fell, what ones? The seeds. So it's between 190 or 200 occurrences in John's gospel, we get a relative clause built with a relative pronoun. Who believed, who were born, of whom I said, that kind of language. Almost always it refers backwards to something that was mentioned in the text. Okay? The one who is not just hanging out there for you to fill in. It's going after somebody who's already mentioned. Catch my point? So, when you go back to 13:23, one of his disciples was reclining at table at Jesus' side, whom Jesus loved. I think, and Witherington is all over this, it's a slam dunk. It's Lazarus. If you're listening and you've heard 4 times that Lazarus is loved by Jesus, and then the next thing you hear is 4 times the one that Jesus loved, you would have filled in without even thinking about it. Even if you're a child sitting at the feet of the reader, you would have put Lazarus in that story right there. Now, why do we put John there? Did you grow up with that belief?
I did. And actually, I wanted to ask, the beloved disciple, if it was Lazarus, does that mean that Lazarus was the one who wrote the Gospel of John?
I think at the end, when we get to 21, it's going to be Lazarus' memoirs, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah. How did we get to John, the Apostle John? This is fascinating, folks, and you can do this with your Bible reference material. I'm not making this up. I would recommend you ask your AI bot or anything you want. Go looking for this information, and what you find will be stunning. Here it is. The traditional view that the beloved disciple was the Apostle John begins with Irenaeus, 180 A.D. It's 150 years after the event, who claimed personal contact with Polycarp, who in turn said, John, quote, the disciple of the Lord who also leaned upon his breast. In other words, Polycarp said it was John, and Irenaeus knew Polycarp, and he said it was John. So, later church fathers echoed this from there on, so Clement, Tertullian, whatever. But here's the point, and again, I would recommend not just Witherington's book. I think Richard Bauckham takes this view as well. I have not read where he says this in his work. There is no textual evidence that John was the beloved disciple, and frankly, much evidence against it. And we'll see this coming up in 19 and 21 and so forth, where he's friendly with the high priest, the beloved disciple. He's friendly with the high priest. He knew the high priest. Well, John is a fisherman in Galilee. There is no evidence that John would have known the high priest, unless there's just a kind of a lucky bounce. But Lazarus, famous Galilean, who's many people came to his funeral. Remember that. It just makes sense that he would be the kind of person who would be knowledgeable of the high priest and friendly with him. So my point is that if you want to go John, go John. The problem is, it's like from Edison to today. It's a long time, 150 years. 150 years from the event to the person who said it. That's the difference between Jesus' day and Polycarp. or Ignatius or Irenaeus. So if you want to go with John, you can, but you've got 150 years of time that gets you to that point, and there's no text for it. It's all tradition from the church. Whereas, go back to our story, the disciple whom Jesus loved has 4 previous references to Lazarus that are indisputable. So to me, it's Lazarus, and I don't see how it can't be.
So the reason I asked the question earlier, if you think the beloved disciple is the same one who authored the actual gospel that we call the Gospel of John, because a part of me is like, I know about the Irenaeus and Polycarp. Basically, it's like a disciple of a disciple of a disciple.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, Polycarp supposedly was one of John's proteges.
Yes, Polycarp claims to have known John. You're right.
And so part of me is like thinking like, well, of course he would say that, because it's like, if I'm the student of John, then like, so of course Irenaeus would then assume like, well, you're the student of John, so you would know because John would probably have told you or something like that.
Well, when it comes to traditions, this is a good one. I mean, you got to admit this is pretty tight, where it's the disciple of a disciple of a disciple, and if that's true, it's pretty heady stuff, and I like it. The problem is, it just doesn't fit the text well, so you're gonna have to make a decision. So,
yeah, I mean, the reason I just asked that question earlier is because, so I asked the Logos AI that question of who wrote the Gospel of John. And actually, ironically, I limited the resources they could look at from Withington.
Yeah.
And part of the answer it gave was the beloved disciple almost certainly did not write the gospel in its current form, partly because it seems implausible he would have repeatedly referred to himself by that title, and partly because passages like John 19 and John 21:24 suggests a later editor's hand.
Right.
However, the beloved disciple may have been a real historical figure who transmitted Jesus' traditions to his community, with the gospel potentially representing his testimony as filtered through later interpretations.
And
so that's why I was wondering.
21.
Yeah.
Right.
1935 and 21:24. And so a part of me wonders, like, I can understand if the beloved disciple's identity was really actually Lazarus. I'm curious if it was John, the actual apostle, who in the end compiled everything down.
I thought Witherington's view, from what I read elsewhere, is that a man named John, whether it be the apostle or not, did compose the book with the help. In fact, well, that's what it says in 21:24. This is the disciple who gave me these things, that said these things, that wrote these things. So it's like taking the memoirs of someone who knew Jesus well, his best friend, and writing a book about those memoirs. That would be, to me, who authored the book. It wouldn't be the beloved disciple as much as the memoirs of the disciple is what gave the writer his main information.
Yeah, and that's why I kind of wonder if maybe in the end it was John who wrote it in a sense, but it's not really his own testimony. It is the compilation, the memories, the memoirs, as you put it, of Lazarus. Yeah. And so thus, anyways, it's interesting. It is a very interesting kind of thing, because then how do you reconcile that other stream of a disciple, especially Polycarp, since we know Polycarp, that anyways, that could be an interesting discussion.
Yeah, Polycarp doesn't himself claim that it's Irenaeus repeating Polycarp. So Polycarp does not name John as the beloved disciple, but Irenaeus says that Polycarp said he did, something like that. So
yeah, but at the same time, Polycarp's reputation also precedes him. He had, I mean, the whole entire martyrdom of Polycarp, of course, that's part of of how we know of him so well.
So let's put the story together then. So Simon Peter motioned to Lazarus, and that's where I'm going with this. Now pretend you're sitting in that room, and Lazarus and Jesus is talking about foot washing and loving each other, and then he says, one of you is going to betray me, and Lazarus is there, and here's what happens. So Simon Peter motioned to Lazarus to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So that disciple, leaning back against Jesus, said to him, Lord, who is it? So now Peter motions, he's not with Jesus, he motions across the room, ask him who it is, something like that. And he leans backward into Jesus' chest, and he probably whispers, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, and I think this was private, it is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it. So when he had dipped the morsel, again, effortlessly, I think Judas was not across the room. He just leans over and hands it somehow. He gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. My guess is at that moment, Lazarus is dumbfounded with surprise. Peter is still asking, who is it? Judas is wondering, what's this got to do with anything? He wasn't told why he was given the bread in this story. And Jesus knows the whole story, right? Then after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered him. Jesus said to him, what you are going to do, do quickly. Now, no one at the table knew why he said this to him. So we're going to talk about Judas coming up. Anything you want to add now at this point?
Well, I mean, I think it's also kind of chilling when you read that line of Satan entered into him.
Yeah.
And then the question is like, so is Jesus talking to Judas? Is he talking to Satan?
Interesting.
Is he talking to both? Like, what happened?
I do take
no
a
explanation.
Pause. Yeah, and I do pause on my next slide. A shared conceptual category can be found in the Bible across narrative, poetic, and didactic genres where, and here's my point, a divine being can, quote, take up residence within a human. The important thing to catch is that symbolism has real meaning, and that is to influence or control thought, speech, or action. And this, to me, these are all synonyms. So I don't get into making a big difference between these kinds of metaphors where you have, and this is all in Greek, sometimes in Hebrew, entering someone, a divine being entering someone, or dwelling in, or we call it indwelling someone. Now, we have Jesus indwelling us, too. In other words, these verses that I'm listing on the screen include Jesus indwelling me, the Spirit indwelling me, an evil spirit indwelling, a non-believer, filling, and we could, multiply that, but I have Acts 2:4 there as an example. Coming upon, remember in Samuel when an evil spirit came upon Saul, I think 3 times. 1 Kings 22, you have, I don't know if it says coming upon, but remember the story of the spirit who said, I will go down and become a lying spirit to Ahab's prophets. How he does that, it doesn't explain, but somehow back to my point, the reality, besides the symbolism, the reality is a spirit can influence, control thought, speech, or action. And the symbolism that the Bible uses, I don't think is meant to be played off against each other. Well, he entered him on this one and he indwelt him on that one. I think this is all symbol. But it does say to me that that's why free will is a nervous word for me. Because how do I know if I'm freely doing anything, if God wants to control my thoughts at some point for some reason, and I go left instead of right, and God wanted me to do it, and therefore he motivated me to do it, and I chose to go left instead of right. Was I freely acting? Not really. Yet I felt free. See, that's the thing. I think a lot of our discussion about free will is based on how it felt at the time, but we don't know what's going on sometimes behind closed doors, especially when it comes to other people. So that's why I like the term real will, not free will. Now, Satan and Judas, and now let's get back to your point. I don't know how, in the text doesn't solve this for us, Mike, but it gives a possibility that Satan entered Judas to the point that Judas became an instrument of a being, and he was, remember in Matthew 27, we're not there yet in the story, he is surprised that Jesus is condemned, and he goes out and kills himself. That surprise element of Matthew 27, when Judas discovers that Jesus wasn't, or that he had been condemned, that lays color back into this story where maybe the entering of Satan into Judas is to imply that he became such an instrument that even Judas himself, was kind of what's the term I want here? bipolar. He wanted and didn't want to. I don't know, something like that. But
if I remember earlier, when we were just at the beginning of this, it was verse 2 in chapter 13 where it was said during supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot to betray him.
Yeah. So it's been
and so I wonder, if anything, it's that was the opening, right? To enter, is that that was the crack within Judas himself that allowed. It's like, well, you've already been entertaining it. Now let me just give you some, not this time liquid courage, but I'll give you basically the little push to actually go through with all of this.
Yeah. So back to the story. Some thought that because Judas had the money bag, that Jesus was telling him, buy what we need for the feast. Remember, the feast is 6 days away. So he was going to head out to buy something to prepare for Passover. Or that he should give something to the poor. So after, and this is only in John, this is not in the other Gospels, where we have the same kind of story of Judas being identified, if not, quietly without anyone knowing it. But here, this is this happens only in John. Receiving the morsel of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night. Night, often in the Bible, especially in poetic passages, has the sense of dread. Time of demonic work, right? And I think there's nothing lost on that here. He went out and it was dark. And you can imagine, again, saying this to the listener, and you get this foreboding sense of what's about to happen. When he had gone out, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. Great line in which to say, when things look bleakest, it's night. Satan's about to do his dastardly deed. This is the greatest moment in my life. My God will be glorified by what I'm about to do. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him at once. Little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. I've often wondered, why is this a new commandment? Well, think again in where we are, going back to John 12, sitting in that house of Lazarus, not the Last Supper, but the house of Lazarus. Let me read what I have here. Jesus' new commandment to love cannot imply that love was absent from Torah. We already have it in Leviticus 19:18, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, which described a central covenantal obligation, right? But maybe that's the point, that a well-intentioned Jew of Jesus' day would look at Leviticus 19:18 and even at face value, love his Jewish neighbor as much as he loved himself. But now, remember what Jesus did. He washed the feet probably of Gentiles and others in the room. Jesus now introduced a command with a symbolic action of love and humility performed on non-Jews in Lazarus' home. Jesus' pattern of costly and redemptive love was therefore new, both in degree and especially compared to Leviticus 19 in identifying the intended recipients. For the first time, I think you have an actual command from either the Father or Jesus. I want you to treat the unclean Gentile as nicely, as lovingly as you treat your neighbor, your Jewish neighbor. So that's to me where the newness of this commandment comes in. It's because he's not at the Last Supper. He is at the home of a man who probably has guests there that, again, people are uncomfortable with. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another. There's another great line that the modern church needs to learn, right? I was taught growing up, and I don't think it was taught. Maybe I should say it was caught. This is how it felt. I was just yesterday, in fact, I drove by in Minneapolis here area. One of the suburbs has a outdoor drive-in theater, okay? And the screen is huge, right? And it kind of, you can kind of see the front of the screen from the highway, but you have to really crane your neck as you're driving by. I remember as a 13-year-old, which would be 50 years ago, so half a century ago. I was about 13, somewhere in there. And we'd come into Minneapolis from out of town where I lived, and we'd do activities in the cities sometimes. And I remember, because I wasn't allowed to go to movies. I couldn't play cards, couldn't listen to rock music. I mean, all the no's, that a fundamentalist can't do. That was my life, and one of them was no movies. Well, you know what I would do, Mike? I would crane my neck and I would look at the screen as I was driving, as I was in the back seat of the car going by, and I felt so bad. I was being so disrespectful to my parents and to God himself because I was watching, albeit 5 seconds of a movie. Now, what has that got to do with this? I wasn't taught maybe, but I certainly caught the idea that the way I was to be known was by what I didn't do. All people will know that you are my disciple if you don't have long hair, you don't listen to the Bee Gees, you don't listen, you don't do this, you don't do that. And again, I hope the audience is saying, Ron, you weren't taught that. No one told you that. Well, then how come I thought it? I mean, that was clearly how I was given the impression from my my teachers or my Sunday school teachers, whatever. And here the whole time, 2,000 years earlier, Jesus said, you know how people are going to know who you are when it comes to your relationship to me is if you can wash someone's feet that you can't imagine washing. That's what's going to make a difference. So we know Jesus said it, we know he meant it, but I'm one of those that needs to learn this as much as anybody. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? Jesus answered him, where I am going, you cannot follow me now. Of course, that's into death itself, but you will follow me afterward. He's going to die later, of course. And Jesus, this happens in John 21. Peter said to him, Lord, why can I not follow you now? He's always confused, isn't he, Peter? I will lay down my life for you, and now you know it's coming. Jesus answered, will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. Now, here is one of those lines that, again, is in the other synoptic gospels. One of them has the rooster will crow twice and you'll deny me thrice. And the other one has just, the rooster will crow. But all 4 gospels have this story. So, yes, to make this work, to make this a Lazarus' home story, you've got to have this happen, or this discussion between Peter and Jesus happen twice. I end with this as we close up John 13. Is John 13 to 17 the last Passover? There are many reasons. No, many. There's 4 basic reasons why, looking back now, a person may say, Ron, no, I disagree with you. We are in the Passover meal with the 12 during this John 13 vignette. Here are 4 reasons why. Similar narrative setting. All 4 Gospels, including John, describe a meal given to his disciples on the eve or in close proximity of Jesus' final arrest. When you come to John 18, right after Jesus closes his conversation, the next thing you know, he's in the Garden of Gethsemane. So that is one of the reasons people think that 13 through 17 is spoken, during the last Passover. Number 2, again, this is answering the yes side. The atmosphere of instruction. Whether it be this or the synoptics, all 4 have this moment of intense teaching with Jesus preparing his disciples for their next mission. Number 3, why of the 4 reasons, here's a 3rd reason why it's probably, or could be the same meal. The synoptics keep Judas's identity a mystery when he predicts his betrayer. Matthew, Mark, and Luke say, he's sitting with me at the table, but he doesn't identify him. John's gospel openly identifies Judas, at least to the beloved disciple. So there's where all 4 agree that Jesus predicts his betrayer. The difference is that John openly identifies Judas, the other 3 don't. So in one sense, it doesn't argue for the similarity, but in another sense, it seems strange that Jesus would do the same. Someone's going to betray me twice. And the last one, which we just went through, Peter denies Jesus in all 4 Gospels. He says, I will never deny you. And Jesus says, no, the rooster will crow and you'll deny me 3 times. On the other hand, and we'll close with this, is John 13 to 17 the last Passover? Here are reasons I would say no. And I've said some of these, so I'll be fast. The institution of the Lord's Supper. The synoptics carefully find Jesus reinterpreting the bread and wine of Passover, right? This is my body. This is my blood. Whereas John's gospel will make no mention of this instruction. And of course, what some people say is, well, it's implied. No, the point is that there is no hint of any Passover or institutional Lord's Supper Eucharist kind of a setting in John 13 through 17. It's just completely absent. Number 2, the washing of feet. Only John's gospel includes the narrative and that teaching around the washing of feet. It never happens in the synoptics. Number 3, the length and content of the discussion. As we just said, John's gospel has 5 chapters of dialogue, and it goes back and forth between the disciples. They're talking about different things, and is very long compared to the synoptics, which is basically just the words of institution, and that's pretty much it. Number 4, the timing in relation to Passover. We mentioned this. It's a big one. The synoptics have Jesus presiding at a Passover meal, clearly, while John's meal, it clearly says 6 days before the Passover. And that has often tripped people up. And I'm thinking, and I'm recommending, that doesn't trip us up. That actually helps us with the timing. And then the last one, of course, is the deipnon. John's gospel refers to the meal of John 13:2 as a deipnon, a term which means supper or dinner and is never used in association with Passover. So for those reasons, those 5, I think they undo the previous 4. And that John 13 to 17, which will continue next time, John 14, that we are in the home of Lazarus 6 days prior to Passover. So anything you want before we close up shop?
I mean, it's an interesting theory. I like some parts of it. I still find it odd that you have the whole entire declaration that Peter is going to deny Jesus. And I mean, I can entertain it in John if we can put in the possibility that time is compressed, because this would imply that by John 18, 6 days have passed, that we've like jumped right after chapter 17's done, that the beginning of chapter 18 means, boom, we went 6 days, we're on, like we just finished the Passover meal itself, and now they're going to the garden.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's one of the reasons that people could make it the same. Yep.
Yeah, so it's one of those things of why
what's going to happen at the end of 14, we'll get this next time, is he says, "Arise, let us go hence." So he does tell the people to get up and go at the end of 14. I was taught that that's now Jesus walking. 15 then is a conversation of the vine and the branches, and that's a conversation of Jesus walking through the streets of Jerusalem on the way out to Gethsemane. So 15, 16, and 17 in that storyline would be a walk between the Last Supper and Gethsemane. And this model would be, I have no idea how it fits, but Jesus for some reason says at the end of 14, we're done, good night, go home. And then 15 through 16 and 17 would be kind of like the Beatitudes, where you don't really know exactly where he said it. Could it have been during those 5 days? I don't know. Yeah, it's fun to think about, but well, let's do it next time with 14. We'll continue this very same story. So thank you. Well, again, if you have questions, send them to questions.dcwp@gmail.com. We are very glad to take them. And can't thank you enough again, Mike, for being my sounding board to some of my ideas, and my appreciation for your love of the text, I hope, is evident as well. So we will talk to you next time. John 14, we'll pick it right up there. And until we talk again, have a blessed week.